You are listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
The Archaeology Podcast Network is sponsored by Codify, a California benefit corporation. Visit Codify at www.codifi.com. Hello and welcome to the Archaeotech Podcast, episode 45. I'm your host, Chris Webster, with my co-host, Chris Sims. On today's show, we talk to Simon Young of Lithodomos VR about archaeologically accurate, immersive virtual places. All right, well, we're here on Archaeotech, and we're going to talk about Lithodomos VR. I was contacted by Alex from Lithodomos just a few days ago as time of recording, and it seemed like a really interesting thing to talk about. We actually talked about doing a show for the Arc 365 podcast. Go check that out. But I thought this warranted a much longer conversation because what they're doing is pretty cool. So we've got on the CEO of Lithodomos, Simon. Simon, how's it going?
It's going very well, Chris. Thank you. How are you?
Good. We've also got, of course, Chris Sims on.
Yep, a pleasure to have you on today, Simon.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Okay, so Simon, why don't you tell us a little bit about Lithodomos VR and what the heck that is?
Excellent. Well, Lithodomos VR is basically a virtual reality content creation company. The name Lithodomos is an ancient Greek word. It means stone mason. And our aim and philosophy is to create archaeologically accurate virtual reality content of the Greek and Roman worlds, which is research driven. So we're very excited about the content we're producing and the future applications of the content and its use on site and off site and really bringing archaeology in the ancient Greek and Roman worlds into the realm of VR.
So what started this whole thing off? How did you come to create a company around this?
Well, while I was doing my PhD here at the University of Melbourne, I was experimenting with 3D visualization software because my PhD thesis is about the ancient cityscape and how observers may have derived meaning from public architecture. So I was very keen to get a view of the street level. So I was playing around with AutoCAD and Blender and using archaeological plans and elevation drawings to create models to do, kind of a 2D print 3D reconstructions. And then about, I think it's 3 years ago now, the Oculus Rift development kit came out. And a neighboring university, La Trobe University, bought one because they thought it would be great to put some archaeology into VR, but they weren't really sure about how to go about it. So they asked me to see what I could do with it. And so I took my 3D models that I'd been working on and I imported them into the game engine Unity and then fired that up in a virtual reality device. And I popped on the headset and hey presto, there I was actually standing in the street of one of my reconstructions. And I thought, hey, this is pretty cool. And so I showed some of my fellow students, and they thought it was pretty cool as well. And then when I spent some time in Austria and also in Turkey, I showed some of my colleagues and archaeologists, and they all thought it was pretty cool as well. And so I was invited to give a few public lectures about the technology and about the project. And then when I submitted my PhD some time ago, I showed a friend of mine who thought it was really cool, who showed a friend of his who runs a incubator startup company called Marketplace Ventures. And he loved it as well. So could see a commercial application of the technology. And so it's kind of taken off from there.
Nice. Simon, could you tell us a little bit about how people think about public spaces and how the Lithodomos technology is working to recreate that in a virtual space?
So that's a good question, Chris. Do you mean ancient public spaces or? Yes. Yeah. So, well, one really incredible thing that I think comes from virtual reality is that we really have no idea what the ancient mind was like. And when we put a virtual reality headset on and experience an ancient cityscape, one thing that came out of my research was that we're really experiencing that cityscape from a completely 21st century observer perspective. So we're kind of like projecting our own values and ideas onto that cityscape. So even though virtuality gives you a sense of the general scale and arrangement of the city, I still think we're quite far removed from what it was like to be there as an ancient observer, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. That's such a fascinating problem to tackle. Yeah, I'm just kind of like racking my brain on that one. Like, what can we do to kind of get to better understand the ancient mind?
Well, one thing that came across in my research as well is, and I'm not sure how many of our listeners are into, well, I think it's quite a pretty standard thing to study architecture, public architecture in archaeology courses at universities these days. And when you read articles and textbooks about public architecture, you quite often are encountered with this kind of shadowy figure of the observer. For example, you might say, the observer entering the city would have noticed the large arch to his or her left, and the observer would have been struck by. And I really realized that who is this observer? And when we read the word observer, our first instinct is to place ourselves in the shoes of that entity and imagine ourselves on the city street and and wondering how we would feel. And then I was thinking, well, how do we get out of that mindset of how do we separate ourselves from that mysterious observer? And I think really the only way is to think about what kind of people would find themselves in an ancient city. And for example, a soldier looking at a fortification wall might perhaps be looking at the wall thinking, well, that's quite a well-built wall. It's going to be difficult to scale. And look at those guards up there. How are we going to attack this? Whereas a slave who is on the other side of the wall may be looking at the same wall and thinking, oh, there's no way I'll ever be able to escape my terrible fate and scale this wall at night. It's too. So something as simple as a wall is open to so many different interpretations. So to a 21st century observer who might think, wow, it's so big. How did they build it back then? To a slave who can't escape, to a soldier who wants to attack the city. So I think it's the only way out of it is to really narrow down exactly who the observer was and at what time and what it meant to them.
I think just a comment on the observer thing. I was just this last summer in August or something like that. I was in Pompeii, and for the second time. The first time I was in Pompeii was almost exactly 20 years before that, when I was in the U.S. Navy, and I was right out of high school. I wasn't an archaeologist, didn't really know anything about that, and even just my two impressions on how I viewed Pompeii from when I was 19 years old or 20 years old or whatever I was, versus 40 years old, 41 years old. It was amazing the way that you just look at that through a different lens. So I always think about that when I'm recording archaeological sites as well, is, we're making all these interpretations over here about different things and different artifacts and features and stuff like that. But like, for example, you look at all this monumental architecture that the Greeks and Romans had. Was that considered monumental architecture to the people of the time, or was it just par for the course? They're like, oh, look what the Romans did again. There's another huge thing that they made. It was just not that big a deal. You know what I mean? And the same thing, like you said, like a soldier would view things differently than an artist or than a farmer would, or something like that. So I think it's a really interesting problem, and it's a really complicated one. But putting yourself in that situation from a VR standpoint goes so much farther to answering that question, I think.
And also, one thing I kind of realized is that no matter because with reconstruction technology, we seem hell bent on achieving perfect photorealism in 3D, and you see that in the gaming industry, you see that in films, you see that in the commercial architecture industry. Everyone will have seen those billboards with the incredible renders of what this new apartment building will look like. So if we apply that to archaeology, I mean, we have this amazing opportunity now to tap into those that skill set that is emerging for photorealistic reconstructions of architecture, and then apply that to the ancient world. But then the question is, once we have that amazing photorealistic environment of the ancient world, doesn't that just heighten our sense of misinterpretation of what we're seeing? We're still seeing it as a 21st century observer, and it doesn't matter how accurate it is, we're still going to be applying our own prejudices and subjective opinions onto what we're seeing.
Yeah,
I think that's pretty funny that we still are bringing the same problems, but they're just in higher definition now.
That's right.
But something that really interested me on your website, on the Lithodomos VR website, is how you talked about using archaeologically accurate reconstructions of these spaces. So could you tell us a little bit about what kinds of lines of data and information you're pulling from archaeology?
Sure. So I think just as a preface to that question, I think as archaeologists, we really have a responsibility to deliver accurate research in our reconstructions of ancient cities, and not to cross the line into fantasy, because really with a 3D, a 2D or a 3D image, we are transmitting the research and hard work of archaeologists over quite often over lifetimes. And so for me, it's really important to go back to all the publications, to collect all the site plans and elevation drawings, and to make sure that everything in the reconstruction is based on published, well-researched material and not fantasy. So that's definitely the first step, is to do a thorough scoping of previously published archaeological records and site plans. The second part of it is to ensure that the textures that we employ in the reconstructions are sampled from the site, match the materials that were used in building, and that any uncertainties, or because you can never be completely certain, obviously, with many reconstructions, any uncertainties are thoroughly backed up by credible parallels or similar building types of a contemporary period. So so does that answer the question?
Absolutely. I think that's wonderful information.
Yeah. Notice on your website that you guys right now focus on Greek and Roman sites. Do you have plans to branch out from there, or I could see why you would focus on those, because there's probably more data about Greek and Roman sites available, like right now, without doing any extra work, than any sites in the entire world, with the possible exception of Egyptian sites, like Egyptian pyramids and things like that. But where do you think you guys are going from here?
Yeah, Chris, that's a great question, and it's something that I'm often asked is why only Greek and Roman? And the reality is that the Greek and Roman world and the material that's available is so vast that this is a colossal undertaking in itself. And I've noticed it in some other VR content creation companies. Their objective or aim is we're going to do a virtual reality version of all of history.
Right.
And it's like, well, that's going to take a really long time. It's going to take a lot of work. So you're absolutely right. I think our aim is to choose this period, which has an enormous wealth of published material already, to do it really, really well, and to specialize in getting that process right. And then we'll entertain, I think, the possibility of opening up perhaps the medieval section of Lithodomos, or perhaps the Central American department of Lithodomos. I mean, but for me as the CEO, what is most important is that the reconstructions are archaeologically accurate, well researched, and 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 responsible.
Okay.
That's awesome. And I do a lot of work in Central America, and I got really excited when you mentioned Central America. I work on Mayan sites every summer, and I think that the problems that Lithodomos works to tackle, like separating fantasy from archaeologically accurate depictions of the past and spaces, is interesting in those contexts. And basically any other sites that you work on, like you had mentioned the example of the soldier or the guard or the slave earlier in this episode, especially in the Maya, there's spaces where only the elites would have ever seen that, and they would have been sacred and totally restricted. And I think that that's a pretty fascinating problem to tackle, is the idea of restricted spaces. But we're going to take our first commercial break, and then we'll be back with more.
Great.
Awesome.
Hello, APN listeners. Today we have some exciting news. The Center for Digital Archaeology, PCS, and Codify have teamed up to create an exciting new online training program built especially for you. Visit digitaltraining.site and you can sign up for free interactive office hour sessions to get help and share ideas about everything from digital photography to drone usage in archaeology, and even tips and tricks on how to prepare for your next job interview. We're offering deep dive, 2-hour webinars and intensive single-day workshops so that you can truly level up your skills. This is cutting-edge training provided by experts in the fields of digital imaging, cultural resource management, business practices, and more. Courses will fill up fast, so visit digitaltraining.site today and see what we have in store for you. That's digitaltraining.site. We look forward to learning with you.
All right, we're back, and I want to talk to you a little bit about, I want to talk to you about how you collect your data otherwise and process your data and things like that. But that being said, first, you have a company, Lithodomos VR. You're the CEO. How do you guys monetize? How do you make money doing this? How do you keep yourselves going?
I'm really glad you asked that question, because it's it's a question that a lot of VR content companies are facing at the moment. It's a bit of a chicken and an egg situation, that there's all this people, hardware producers want the general public to buy hardware devices, but there's no real content for the hardware devices yet. And so because there's not much content, not many people are buying hardware sets, so they're not buying the content. It is a bit tricky. But having said that, we see a wide range of monetization streams. One of the most exciting ones that we're working on at the moment is to put VR on site at archaeological excavations, so that when you visit, say, for example, the Roman Forum, you're confronted with a pile of, for the layman or for many of us, is rubble.
Right.
You can take out your portable VR headset, pop it on, and you see a beautifully reconstructed, immersive vision of the particular building you're looking at. Because at the moment, the alternative is one of those information boards, which is basically a 5,000 word essay, and that's the last thing you want to be looking at on a 40 degrees Celsius day in Rome, trying to work your way through a faded.
Yeah.
Personally, I just take a photo and say, "I'll read this later," and never do.
Yeah. No, I see the. I totally thought about that, because as I've gotten more, like I said, I hit Pompeii for the second time, and not only was I older and now an archaeologist and had this different worldview, but I'm also way more into technology and kind of way in tune with what's possible and what's going on. And as I'm walking around Pompeii with my wife, and we're following this tour guide, and this guy, he was doing a good job, don't get me wrong, but I don't think everybody in our group was understanding him. I know there was at least 4 different languages being spoken by the people in our group, and he was speaking English, because that's usually the easiest for them to do. And I just don't feel like, I mean, they were doing the best that they could, and we got the best tour that we could given the situation. But if I could have just thrown on a VR headset, been able to see the real ground, because I don't want to fall and trip, because Pompeii is just filled with ruts and rocks and stuff all over the place. But if I could see where I'm going and walk around that thing, but also have some auditory cues, maybe see some some clearly virtual people walking around and amongst the actual tourists that are there, and be able to interact, really augmented reality rather than virtual reality, but a combination of the two. My God, that would have just been so much more immersive and interactive, and it would have been fantastic. And then on top of that, from a VR standpoint, being able to throw on my VR headset from the hotel room before I go, walk around Pompeii, get my bearings, so when I get there, I don't waste my time. Like, I know where I'm going and what I want to see, with my own two eyes.
Not to mention with sites like Pompeii and many other archaeological sites, I think that brings a really unique potential for site conservation. And so, as we're all familiar in the field, oftentimes the best case scenario is to actually not excavate a site. So I think it would allow us to preserve sites. Is that something that you've encountered so far with Lithodomos?
Absolutely, it's a non-destructive way of reconstructing buildings. That preserves the archaeological record. In Turkey, where I work, quite a lot of on-site reconstruction takes place. There is quite a bit of pressure to reconstruct buildings because places like Ephesus, for example, received millions of tourists a year, and really it's a commercial industry. And so that leads nicely back into the idea of how does Lithodomos commercialize or monetize, and that's one way, by tapping into and recognizing that the reality of many popular archaeological sites is that they are businesses.
Right.
That they derive revenue, and it kind of leads back to questions about universities and grant systems and VR projects. How virtual reality in the past has, within archaeology, as many of you are probably aware, been grant driven. So you come up with an idea for a VR installation. Your project goes to a committee. The committee looks at it, decides whether or not they'll fund it, which takes several months, and then it gets funded, the VR content gets produced, and then it's set up in a museum or faculty somewhere, and a few hundred people, or a couple of thousand people view it, and then the project is dead. So by making the virtual reality on a commercial model, it really has the chance to evolve, to grow, to develop, to interact with a large amount of people rather than a select few of academics and students and interested parties. So I think commercializing archaeology in VR is really a way of reaching more people, and people who are on site and interested and want to know what they're looking at.
So in the vein of reaching more people, how can your virtual reconstructions currently be viewed?
Oh, very, very good question. So at the moment, we have an app on the Google Play App Store. It's Ancient Jerusalem in VR, and hopefully in the next few days, we will release our free demo app, which has 3 sites: the Odeon of Agrippa in Athens, the Arène de Lutèce, a little-known gladiatorial arena in the 10th arrondissement of Paris, and the exterior of the Temple of Venus in Rome, and that will be freely downloadable. And in the coming weeks, these apps will also appear on the App Store for iPhone.
Nice.
And also on the Samsung Oculus Store for Samsung Gear. So within the month, we hope that these 2 apps will be available both for the VR. Ancient Jerusalem in VR is $2.99, but the demo app will be free and contains reconstructions and short videos as well.
So is the Ancient Jerusalem in VR app, is that designed right now to be viewed just like wherever you're at, you download the app and you can kind of look around and navigate and do things? Or is it also geo-referenced so you can physically take it somewhere and use it that way, or not yet?
Exactly. So it's designed both for use at home and or in Actually, this in January, I'll be giving a workshop at the University of Melbourne, and as a guest lecturer, I'm teaching, giving a class on applications of virtuality for up and coming archaeologists.
Nice.
So we're going to be using that app as an educational tool.
Okay.
So within the context of a university, at home, and also it is geo-referenced. So you can go to the Western Wall and you can plonk yourself in one position, put on your virtuality headset, and then see the geo-referenced image around you. So has multi uses.
How do you decide? Like, it says ancient Jerusalem, but that covers a pretty wide swath of time. How do you decide what somebody actually sees? Yeah, I mean, I know the big architecture and things like that. You're probably reconstructing those and making sure that it's realistic. But do you have any other? Because I haven't seen inside the app. I've seen the video you guys have, but do you have any other touches that are like ambiance sort of touches? And if so, how do you decide what kind of time period to set those in?
Right. So we decided to place ancient Jerusalem in VR in the first century AD, just after the construction or the amplification of the Second Temple by Herod the Great, and we decided to place it near the Western Wall so that people who are visiting the site can see the virtual reconstruction when they're there. And yeah, this particular experience is centered around the Western Wall and the area around the Western Wall. We are looking at expanding the experience to Herod's palace and also to the Roman city on the southwestern slope of Mount Zion. So that's the great thing about the project, is that there's so much that we can do.
Yeah.
But of course, when we say that it's ancient Jerusalem in VR, it's not every single building and every single paving stone of the city. That to do that well would take years and years. So yeah, we choose carefully. We take carefully chosen reference points within the city where you can get a sense of what an ancient observer may have seen from that position.
Okay. So do you guys do any data collection on your own? We talked about this a little bit earlier, that you're using, you're definitely on sites that have a lot of data already, but are you out taking any photographs for like any photogrammetry or, any sort of drone imagery or anything like that to enhance the models that you're making?
Yeah. Our first project was in Antalya, in Turkey, and we actually made a photogrammetry model of Hadrian's Arch in Antalya, and sampled the textures there, and used that photogrammetry model to refine a 3D model of the arch for use on site. I mean, it's tough. Photogrammetry is great for accurate recording of artifacts. It's not so great for VR, it turns out, because as you may know, the polygon count becomes, for the higher the detail of the model, the polygon count goes through the roof. So so quite often you'll have a wall which is quite plain looking, really. But with photogrammetry, you might end up with several billion floating points.
Right.
Whereas in virtual reality, you could achieve the same effect with a plane with 4 vertices and a nice texture mat on top of that. So it's kind of creating the model is a balancing act between photogrammetry and 3D modeling and texture gathering. I realized quite early on there's no magic bullet for recording a site for use in VR.
Yeah. Okay. Now, have you thought about? Do you have on your long-term roadmap the idea of bringing in other senses, like other touch-sensitive devices, or sound, or smells, or anything like that, to kind of really enhance the experience?
Yeah. So haptics. I was talking the other day with one of my colleagues that the particular application for VR we have at the moment is as we know, for use on site and at home. And so I don't recommend people put on their virtuality headset in Pompeii and start walking around without seeing where they're going.
Yeah.
So the experiences we have are definitely best enjoyed stationary. And if you want to get to another perspective, you take off the headset, walk to the next point, and put on the glasses. So it's a safety measure. But obviously, our models are designed so that in the long term they can also be used for virtuality experiences where you put on your like an HTC Vive, which has sensors, and you can move around the space. And one interesting, great application would be to, for example, be in an ancient city in an HTC Vive with hand controls, and then to have a very nicely photogrammetry scanned piece of ceramic that you could then pick up then look at and examine and then place back into its context.
That's really cool. So this makes me wonder, so what all's involved in the undertaking to do one of these reconstructions? Like if someone's running a large archaeological project and they want to get in touch with Lithodomos VR about bringing you in to help them out with their site, what would that entail?
Well, luckily, what has emerged within our work process and business plan is what I am really striving to do is to bridge the gap between academia and commercial interests. So we've devised a template academic scope document that we can provide to directors of excavations or any archaeologists for that matter. That's academic in nature. So it's basically a report with diagrams and references and kind of like a long essay, if you will. And the way that our 3D modelers and texture artists have been trained is that they can take that academically referenced and researched document and use that as the blueprint for the project. And because accuracy and research-driven models are so important, we also invite that if a university or the director of an excavation wishes to produce VR for their site, that they are actively involved in the process of the creation of the 3D content. And that means regular meetings with the 3D artists and modelers to check to see how the progress is going, to make sure that everything is where it should be, to pick up any errors, and of course at the end to revise the model and the scene and decide whether it's satisfactory and make any last minute refinements before it becomes available to the public. And this academic scope document also becomes very handy because it forms the basis of audio guides or academic reports or so we're striving to bring together the academic research-driven world and the commercialization of this product.
That's very cool and very thorough too. I'm super impressed by that.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, that I'm glad you talked about all that. And I'm glad Chris asked that question because that was definitely on my list of things to ask. Because as a contract archaeologist here in the United States, I'm constantly recording archaeological sites that, because of the nature of the project, I work in the Great Basin in Nevada, so there's a really good chance that right after I record this site, it's going to be destroyed by a mine or a pipeline or something like that. So, in the future, I mean, I know this is a long process right now, but I'd love to work to a point where we could call you up and say, all right, what's our quick and dirty VR kit? So I can be out there in the field. I can record a small site, nothing big, nothing monumental. It's just a site, and I'm going to record everything about it. I can collect all the sights and sounds of it for somebody to visit later virtually, and do that in a quick and effective manner. That would be something to strive for me.
Absolutely. And we're talking a lot about creating an ecosystem for archaeologists and a virtual library. So when you're on site and you find an interesting artifact, you can pop on your VR headset and go through the virtual library and find parallels, and then grab a piece of ceramic and then compare it in real time to what you're seeing.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, we've only got a couple minutes left. I feel like we could talk to you about this all day long. But is there anything we didn't ask you that you really want to mention about Lithodomos VR? Like maybe where you're going, in the near future, things like that. I've got lots of questions about futuristic museums. Have you seen the new show Westworld? Because I feel like that's where it's all going.
I love the show.
That's our goal for 2017 is to mention Westworld in every episode of Archaeotech.
Yeah. I mean, I figured that's where all this ends up.
Yeah. Well, as a closing comment, I guess just to share with your listeners that we're very excited about the possibilities of Lithodomos VR, and we see it as a collaborative effort with archaeologists globally to work with us to create amazing VR content for archaeology and for the ancient world, and to really bring, because I think it's VR in archaeology it has a very clear application, and it'd be great to see it on site in museums, at home, sooner rather than later.
Yeah, and not only that, but just the access to these sorts of things that people that can't travel halfway around the world, from our standpoint, to go see one of these sites, they can still benefit from the rich history that it has to offer by doing more than just looking at it on a website and looking at photographs and Google Images or something like that. They can really experience that without going anywhere. And not to mention people who are disabled in some way and just can't do it. I mean, Pompeii is a really hard place to walk around. I don't know how you would do it. Yeah, if you had any mobility issues. So
that's true.
All right, well, thanks a lot, Simon. We've got links to a lot of the things we talked about in the show notes, and we look forward to everything you guys have coming out in the future. Pretty exciting.
Excellent. Thank you very much for the chat. It was great.
That's it for another episode of the Archaeotech Podcast. Links to some of the items mentioned on the show are in the show notes for this podcast, which can be found at www.archaeologypodcastnetwork.com/Archaeotech. If you like the show and want to comment, please do. You can leave comments about this or any other episode on the website or on the iTunes page for this episode. You can also email us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com or use the contact form on the podcast webpage. If you'd like us to answer a question on a future episode, email us. Use the contact form on the website or tweet your questions with the hashtag Archaeotech or tag @ArchPodNet in your tweet. Please share the link to this show wherever you saw it. If you'd like to subscribe to this podcast, you can do so on iTunes or on Stitcher Radio. You can also type the name of the podcast into your favorite podcasting app and subscribe that way. Don't forget to go over to iTunes and leave a review of the show. It helps us get noticed so more people can find our podcast and benefit from the content. Also, send us show suggestions and interview suggestions. We want this to be a resource for field technicians everywhere, and we want to know what you want to know about. This show is produced by Chris Webster and Tristan Boyle, and edited by Chris Sims.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.archaeologypodcastnetwork.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.
Thanks again for listening to this episode and for supporting the Archaeology Podcast Network. If you want these shows to keep going, consider becoming a member for just $7.99 a month. That's cheaper than a venti quad eggnog latte. Go to archpodnet.com/members for more info.